So greetings from Pennsylvania once again. We're still out here in Western PA. Of course, today we're visiting a number of French and Indian War sites, and we just visited Jumonville Glen and Fort Necessity. And just down the road from those two places is Braddock's grave, which is in a slightly different time frame than the other two places. Those were in 1754. Braddock's grave is about a year later in 1755, when Braddock himself was buried here. It's kind of a busy location right off of Route 40 here in Fayette County, so you might hear a bunch of traffic. Maybe we're going to check this place out. There's some monuments, and somewhere there's the original older monument. I'm not sure if we'll find that. But there's a little story to tell about why General Braddock is buried here at this spot. Yeah, so we are right off of Route 40. You can see the traffic over there, but Fort Necessity is up that way, and Jumonville Glen is off to the west. They do have a nice small parking lot here. There's Naomi, but across the way is the modern memorial to Braddock, and down at the bottom here is what they call the remnants of what's called the Braddock Road. We'll talk about that a little bit maybe. But I'm going to head to where the original site is located. Might be a little bit quieter down that way. Yeah, down at the bottom here there's a trace of what's called Braddock's Road, and we're going to head down there. Yeah, down at the bottom of these steps is the old Braddock Road. Up there is the modern memorial and the modern road, which replaced the one down here. Let's head down here, because here's the original site of his grave. Yes, so once again we are walking along history. This road has a lot of history to it. Probably the first road built in this area. It was largely for, military purposes. This tablet marks the spot where Major General Edward Braddock was buried July 14th, 1755. His remains were removed in 1804 to the site of the present monument. The road doesn't end here, but at this point, it got eroded out by the stream probably and continues on up that way. So it's a little quieter down here by the original grave site. A little bit quieter. But yeah, Braddock's Road has a really interesting history to it. Of course, it was built, a lot of it was built by, well, not by Braddock himself, but by his troops. I think parts of it had been built and kind of mapped out by Washington the year before on some of his trips, because he had built Fort Necessity up here the year before. So some of this had already been laid out, but Braddock's the one that kind of turned it more into a road. It was the major route through this part. I have a book on it at home about Braddock's Road, and here and there you can still see remnants of it. Some parts of it are still parts of roads today, but then there's parts like this which are just kind of forgotten a little bit. Yeah, you'll notice his grave site is built directly in the middle of this road. I mean, this is the road. Let me turn around down here so you can see it going up the other way. So why would someone be buried in the middle of a road? And that was done deliberately. There you can see the road. He's buried right in the middle of it. So who was Major General Edward Braddock, and what was he doing way out here? Of course, back in 1755, this was absolute wilderness. But if you remember from previous videos, this area was, the control of this area was being, vested between Britain and France at the time. And that's what the French and Indian War, of course, in other parts of the world was called the 7 Years' War. But they were fighting over this land, and that's why Edward Braddock was here. Because remember, the year before Washington, the war started over in Jumonville Glen, and Washington attacked a small force of French, and then of course he surrendered at Fort Necessity later in July of 1754. So a year later, Braddock was set by the British to, I guess you could say, reverse the fortunes of the British in this area and to take control back from the French. So he set out here in the spring of 1755. It took him a while to get up this way because they're kind of building the road as they went. But yeah, things did not go so well. But we'll talk about that in a moment. Not so well at all. I found a little trail here to walk on. Maybe we'll can get away from that traffic noise a little bit. There's a lot of truck traffic on that highway. Yeah, but Braddock led the largest army that this region had ever seen up until then. He had 2,400 men under his command. A lot of them were British regular soldiers, some of them were Virginia militia, and a number of them were Native Americans. So as I said earlier, he was here to take control of the area back from the French, and he was headed up to what is today now Pittsburgh area, what the French called Fort Duquesne. And at some point his army split. I think about 1,000 men stayed behind, because as they were moving along, they were actually building this road too, making it more wider and things like that, and it was slowing them down considerably. So about 1,000 men stayed behind with the luggage, while he moved ahead with about 1,400 men closer to Fort Duquesne. But, you know, unfortunately, the French and the Indians knew he was coming. I mean, it was no secret. He couldn't exactly hide his advance, and they were waiting for him. It was called the Battle of Monongahela, or sometimes the Battle of the Wilderness, and they ambushed him not too far from the fort. He and his men didn't see it coming. So he suffered. Of the 1,400 men, I think 900 died. It was just total chaos. Because once the attack started, the men in the front started, falling back, while the men, because they were still like in formation as they were walking along, they weren't like in a battle line. So the men in front started falling back, but the men in the back were still coming forward, and they just kind of collided with each other, and it's just chaos. It was a mess. A lot of the officers were killed, which led to more chaos. Braddock himself was shot in the lung. He didn't die there. That was July 9th. He died here a couple days later on July 14th. But it was a mortal wound, though. Of course, some people say he probably could have survived, but that he died of anxiety instead because of what happened. Yeah, it was brutal. And yes, George Washington was a part of this battle. He was here with Braddock. He had volunteered to help Braddock, and he obviously did survive the battle. In fact, he's the one that led what was left of the troops back away from the disaster, back to what's called Great Meadows, or where the location of Fort Necessity is. He led them back, and he's the one that buried General Braddock in the middle of the road. And I have some words here to read that were written by George Washington upon the death of General Braddock. This is what George Washington says about him. "Thus died a man whose good and bad qualities were intimately blended." It's kind of interesting. And of course, I always have to throw a little bit of nature in my videos here, even if they are history. Check out these mushrooms. These are chicken mushrooms. More specifically, sulfur chicken mushrooms. They're actually edible, but yeah, just be careful eating edible mushrooms. They are beautiful. All right. And then, of course, Braddock himself died 3 days later, during their retreat from the Battle of Monongahela, or the Battle of the Wilderness. So he never made it back to Fort Necessity, or what they call Great Meadows, where we were earlier today. He died we're not too far from there at all. It's just down the road. But that doesn't explain why he's buried in the middle of the road down here. It was done for a reason. Yeah, so once again, right down there is his original burial site. And there's the old road. So why did Washington bury General Braddock in the middle of the road? It was meant to protect his body, because he figured especially if the Indians found his body, that they would desecrate it, which is what they often did. They would scalp the wounded and the dead, strip them of their clothes and other valuables. And he didn't want that to happen to Braddock's body, because he was an officer and a general. So he had him buried in the middle of the road, and afterwards he had all the troops trample over this spot to cover up any signs that someone had been buried there. So anyone walking along the road wouldn't know that there was a grave there. So it was meant just to protect the body. Maybe there were intentions later on to recover the body, I don't know. But as the sign back there says, in 1804, they were doing construction along this road. So it means it was probably being used still in the early 1800s. And they dug up some bones. And I think they figured it was his body, because there was the buttons from his uniform were there, signifying that that's who it was. Probably the rank and insignia were on the buttons. And they realized that was probably General Braddock's grave. And unfortunately, too, some of his remains were taken away. I guess you could say plundered. Some ended up in museums or people's personal collections. But I think they were able to recover most of it, except for a few of the bones. And that's And then he's reburied up here at this monument up here. So we will walk up there in a moment, but just a warning, it is going to be pretty loud up there with traffic, but let's go check it out anyway. Yeah, so down that way was his original gravesite along the old road, but we'll take a walk up here. Of course, the modern highway up here replaced Braddock's road at some point in time. Yeah, here we go, a secret grave. Of course, you can read some of that. We've already talked about most of it. Yeah, the granite monument was added in 1913 to mark the grave. All right, let's check it out. This monument was erected and dedicated to the memory of Major General Edward Braddock. Yeah, here's a little bit more information about Braddock's Road. 1750, Delaware Indian blazed company path for the Ohio Company. 4 years later, George Washington cut a narrow road through this wilderness. And then in 1755, Braddock widened Washington's road, extended to the Monongahela River. And here's the map. Of course, here's where we are roughly, the Fort of Site Necessity, which is, of course, the grave site is just up from there. That's where the battle of Monongahela took place, and then they had to retreat back to here. Yeah, so back down on the old road bed. And it is, man, you're walking through history. I mean, this is where Braddock's army walked through here. 2,400 men, the largest army in that time to come through this region. George Washington traveled this path a number of times. And right up ahead where that site is, that's where they had a little burial ceremony for General Braddock. You know, George Washington oversaw the burial of him. He would have stood right down there, overseeing the burial. So when you stand next to that marker, you're standing where George Washington stood, which is kind of interesting. And now, over 250 years later, this is all that's left. You're walking into history. I think we forget that sometimes when we come to these places. We kind of stop in for a quick visit. Don't really ponder what happened here, who was here. You know, so I could be standing right where George Washington stood when he laid General Braddock in his grave. So that'll be it for this video, and that will also conclude my filming of French and Indian War sites out here today. There's a ton more sites out here to visit, but you know, I got so much time on these trips. But yeah, anyway, as always, thanks for coming along. Thanks again to those of you who support my channel and my Patreon members. Makes coming out to places like this possible. Alright, but I'm not done filming today or tomorrow yet, but I think today I'm going to head back down to Ohiopyle State Park and do some hiking down there. Alright, hope to see you around yet.